is Ruin This Book, a podcast where we, Nicole and Eden, read a banned or challenged book twice a month and discuss its meaning, impact, and censorship to make it more accessible for all readers. This week's book is For Whom the Bell Tolls by Ernest Hemingway, which was published in 1940, in which I did not finish because it was the most boring book I've ever read.
Oh my gosh.
Nicole, off to you to summarize.
I finished it and I loved it. I thought it was timely, which is exactly what I'm going to say about our next book as well. But so the story, it's a Hemingway novel published in 1940. The story follows an American expat named Robert Jordan who goes to Spain to fight on the Republic's side against the fascist regime that is about to overthrow the country. And it's just a series of different battles and his working with the different like rebels, and he falls in love. A lot of people die. And that basically is it. It's actually a very depressing and gruesome story. It's based off of, the title is based off of, I believe it's John Donne's poem.
Correct.
And it has that line, "No man is an island," in that poem also, which is pretty cool. I didn't know that. But it ends and it says, "I am involved in mankind and therefore never send to know for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee." So it's just this idea that we're all interconnected. What happens to one will happen to the other. And I think that's the best summary I can give, really.
Yeah. Well, I got a lot out of the poem itself that the title comes from. So do you mind if I read the whole poem?
Please do. Thank you, Mr. Dunn.
Yeah. No man is an island entire of itself. Each is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. If a clod be washed away by the sea, Europe is the less, as well as if a promontory were, as well as if a manor of thine own or of thine friends were. Each man's death diminishes me, for I am involved in mankind. Therefore send not to know for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee.
What did you get out of that?
So I read the Spark Notes, so I could at least contribute to this conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And having this poem and obviously the Spark Notes offers a great analysis. It kind of brings more depth to the book that I did not get from reading it because I was so bored to death.
Why were you so bored? I want to hear about that.
I don't know.
Your experience, a little context, Eden's experience is not unique. On Goodreads, if you look, there are like so many people did not finish this book. Tom, 11 years ago, said, okay, we don't know Tom, by the way. That's just his username on Goodreads. At one point, he says, "I've choked down some mediocre books before for the sake of fulfilling my civic duty as a long-standing member of our book club, but I couldn't do it this time." Like, he couldn't even bear reading it. Another person, he says, "My advice to all of you is to stay well away from this mess. There's nothing to see here, folks. If you're interested in reading in a book on the Spanish Civil War, read Orwell's Homage to Catalonia. If you want a good book about a bridge, and hey, who doesn't? Read Willa Cather's Alexander's Bridge. God, for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for me." So, like, this person is Barry, and Barry really hated it, like, could not even finish it. And so there were so many people like that. So when Eden said that she couldn't finish it, I was like, interesting. Tell me more. Why?
The language of it all was so boring. Like, it just like did not captivate me at all. Like, it felt like very unimaginative, and typically like the war, I don't read many war novels or whatever, but there tends to be like a pretty visible layer of theme and motifs in war novels that make it more accessible, and this book did not feel accessible. So I literally felt like I was just listening to people hiding out in the countryside, trying to figure out how to blow up a bridge. And, frankly, that part of The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly was so boring too. Like, like I don't know what I was expecting from this book, but like,
yeah.
But like knowing the poem now, and yeah, I just wish that it was, I don't want to say better written because Hemingway's supposed to be one of the greats, right? But I do love The Old Man and the Sea and The Sun Also Rises.
That's interesting to me because The Old Man and the Sea is way more boring than this book. Yet they're very similar in that they're both like this monotonous battle that is tedious, but it's like pushing this man to the very edge and realizing their greatness is futile in the midst of this challenge, yada, yada. It's just like a very tedious, continual, never-ending battle with the big shark or whatever, fish or whatever he's fighting. And that is like, it felt very similar to this book with less characters.
Interesting. And I wonder, maybe my ultimate issue with the book is like, this could have been shorter. But because like The Old Man and the Sea, so short, and it got the same message, well, not same message, well, similar message across. And probably I like The Old Man and the Sea because it was no Moby Dick, you know?
Oh my gosh.
And let's talk about monotonous and, you know.
I've never read Moby Dick because it just kind of intimidates me.
Okay, well, if you like this book, you probably would like Moby Dick. Tell me what you loved about it.
Yeah, so one of the big critiques, and this is one reason why I really loved it, was the language that's used is very formal. It does a lot of these thous when they're speaking to each other, in reference to how Spain's Spanish is used. They use the vosotros, and that is kind of a thee, thou kind of thing. Whereas we don't really hear that. It's not used as often in the Spanish that's spoken in Mexico and further south throughout South America. And so it is very specific to Spain. And I thought it was a really interesting choice for Ernest Hemingway to use it like as if he's translating directly from the Spanish to us. Like it was very much a reporter style kind of writing. It was less novel. It was just very much like a war correspondent and then translating directly the Spanish to how we would read it. And I thought that was really interesting. And like, I enjoyed that. Another big critique is a lot of the swearing is edited out in a really fascinating way. And I did research on it and I was like, is that how it was originally when it was published? Or is that just different publishers' ideas? No, that was the original publication. Censored a lot of the swearing. So there were so many interesting language choices that were very of 1940 when it was published. The Spanish Civil War ended in 1939. So when Ernest Hemingway was writing it, and we know that the people fighting for the Republic lost, that it became a fascist government. And so Ernest Hemingway is writing this as if he's a correspondent, and we know he went to Spain to fight in the Civil War. So it is kind of like he's just writing a journal, but using different characters. And he's publishing it knowing that they lost terribly.
Yeah.
And that was an interesting perspective for me because it was like, I can't imagine, we don't have any like books about like Vietnam losing so badly and still making it like this fight for humanity, because there was no righteousness in our fight in Vietnam as Americans. You know, whereas there's a righteousness in this fight. And even though like by the middle of the book, you know, they're going to lose, like they're dying so quickly. And there's such it feels futile. The fight is, but it's that desperation and ugliness that just felt really timely for me to read. Considering we're quickly and slowly like sliding into fascism, and the way that we're talking about immigration, the way we're talking about protest, the way we're talking about freedom of speech is very authoritarian. And so I don't know, there's just this interesting like willingness and honor in the fight, even though they knew they were going to lose. And I don't know if we hold that very well as Americans. I mean, we definitely don't see that in the Democratic Party. There's none of that verb. Oh shit. There's a quote that I really loved. And it was near the end of the book. And it is, "The world is a fine place and worth fighting for, and I hate very much to leave it." That I think summarizes the entire book. It's the idea that there's still good in the world. It's very like Sam and Frodo going to Mordor.
Yeah.
And it's worth fighting for. But it is, yeah. But there is like an acknowledgement that believing it is inevitable. They're all going to die. And it ends with all of them basically dying.
Yeah.
Yeah, not spoiler alert. So I loved it just because I loved the fight. I loved reading about that like fervor and that willingness to sacrifice because the cause is worthwhile.
Yeah.
Even though they know they're not going to succeed, but that the fight matters. I have my qualms with Hemingway's writing. He is supposed to be the greatest.
Yeah.
And he bleeds with so much misogyny and and that I don't know, and it's just like very black and white, like the way that his main characters always view the world. There isn't a lot of nuance, which is kind of a contrast to like F. Scott Fitzgerald. All of F. Scott Fitzgerald's characters are so gray and so confused. So it's interesting thinking about them as contemporaries. And maybe it's that black and white that is seen as like a masculine trait. Because Hemingway is considered like the most manly masculine.
Yeah.
Whoa, you know? I kill tigers kind of energy.
Yeah. The running of the bulls, you know.
Yeah.
I'm so alive. Look at these Spaniards who look at death in the face.
Yes. And the women we admire in For Whom the Bell Tolls are like these like really gruff ladies, older women that are just like fighting. That are more masculine, more courage than anyone else in the group. And yeah, it's interesting the values that he places on different characteristics and attributes of people. It's very strength matters, which is also very fascist, to be honest. It's very totalitarian, but he's just on the other side of the political coin.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
So there's actually there's a term that a critic named Philip Young coined this term called code hero. And so I'm just going to quote SparkNotes. So the tragedy of the code hero is that he is mortal and knows that he will ultimately lose the struggle. Meanwhile, he lives according to a code, hence the term code hero, that helps him endure a life full of stress and tension with courage and grace.
That's interesting.
Yeah. Tell me your thoughts on that.
Well, that makes me immediately think of like, because of the code hero, but like the hero's journey, in order to live in those universes, you have to have like a strict line of good and evil. Same thing with that code, what you said about the code hero. And depending on what side of the coin you're on, you can weaponize it. However,
totally.
I blame the hero's journey for a lot of the conspiracy theories also today. But because people want to be a hero, you know, they want to have like absolute evil to fight against. Could you repeat that quote one more time?
The tragedy of the code hero is that he is mortal and knows that he will ultimately lose the struggle. Meanwhile, he lives according to a code, hence the term code hero, that helps him endure a life full of stress and tension with courage and grace.
Yeah, I think that black and white is the code that he's living by. But like I had a boyfriend once say, because he was very liberal and like very progressive, almost to the point of like aggressively progressive, who was like, if he was born in a different life or family or whatever community, he'd definitely be a cop, which is the complete opposite of what he was like. But it's the same. It's those same like black and whites that you're living in. You're living within some sort of code at all times. You could have easily said that Hemingway's character was fighting for the fascist government. Because I don't know. Like there wasn't any tenets in the book. Like they talked about freedom all the time, but don't the fascists as well?
Yeah. I mean, even with the like what we talked about earlier in the news. Like you could like someone looking at that on the other side who sides with the current government and administration would see that as like a good. This is like serving our cause. This is following our code. Versus us where we're seeing like instances of censorship and repercussions for speaking out in a country that says that we are for freedom of speech.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it just becomes interesting. Like both sides are citing the Constitution as their code, but both are interpreting it like totally different. And one might see the other destroying the Constitution, but really, like the other side just sees themselves as upholding it.
Yeah.
And it's so confusing and so hard to parse through. And
It
I don't
gets
know, like,
messy.
it
Yeah.
gets messy? Can you make someone a bad guy if they are following the code that they've been given?
Well, right. I mean, that's martyrdom, you know? Like,
Uh-huh.
you can be a martyr for whatever cause. It doesn't mean that the cause is worthy, but because you are dedicated to that cause, does
You
that
can be a
make it
hero.
somehow, yeah, there's a hero aspect to that.
Mhm,
The characters that I found most compelling in this book
mhm, mhm.
were they were other Americans that had joined, and then there was the girl who he falls in love with, who's definitely too young. There's like a
Uh-huh.
lot there, you know, but it's very Hemingway-esque. But anyways, they tell the story of like how her family were killed and how she was abused and her hair was cut and shaven by the fascist soldiers, and just like how people were disappearing very quickly from her town for
Mhm.
speaking up, for having morals, and those morals were kind of encompassing compassion, kindness, education, and a willingness to accept lots of different perspectives. I found them to be a moral and compelling group of people, those who had disappeared,
Mhm.
because they like stood for something that wasn't just our side, but they stood for like education, science, inclusion, and all these
Yeah.
other bits. It's a difficult conversation because how do we retain the humanity in ourselves and in other people while
Yeah.
still holding firm to a code or to an ideology? Does the ideology matter as much as how we treat one another? Or, you
Yeah.
know, and I don't like, or does the ideology incentivize or motivate how we treat other people?
Mhm. It reminds me of like an earlier thing that we might have talked about it during our Entango Makes 3,
Yeah.
and I want to say maybe Handmaid's Tale, where like if your code is about expanding your community,
Mm.
then that is a great moral code to live by, versus like a code that is all about restricting community. Um, that becomes one that is not a good code. And like how we can really parse out heroes from villains, a good code versus a bad code.
Yeah, that's a good point. And in terms of that poem,
Mm-hmm.
it is the essence that we are all connected. We are community. That's within
Yeah.
our humanity. And
Yeah.
when one person dies, that impacts us too.
Mm-hmm.
Which I guess you could argue then war is never going to be moral cause
No. Yeah.
because it's destroying community and destroying each other.
Yeah.
But it does make you wonder, like, at what point should you light yourself on fire to keep other people warm?
Mm.
Or, you know, is martyrdom actually moral? They asked this question a lot of Robert Jordan in the book because he didn't have to fight in this war. He came
Mm-hmm.
over because he's like an expert in blowing stuff up. And the
Yeah.
last guy who was an expert in blowing stuff up died trying to do this. And there's the husband of like the older woman who's like gruff and cool.
Mm-hmm.
He's very cynical about this mission and this operation. And so he's seen as a traitor at different points. He comes back, he leaves. He's just very waffly on it because he doesn't see the point or the moral value of going through the sacrifice because it feels like the war is already lost. So is the effort even worth it? Like there's so many questions that this book brings up about war, sacrifice, death. Like at what point is it all just like dross that doesn't mean anything?
Mm-hmm.
But they would argue that it does mean like that the effort to fight does mean something, that there's moral value in that. And that's where the humanity is. but I'm not 100% convinced because also Ernest Hemingway treats all people that are different than him very badly.
Mm-hmm. Do you think, was this book a criticism of war, or do you think it was mostly taking a stance of, yeah, they lost, but the Republic should have won? Wait, was it the Republic?
The Republic, I know. I don't think it's a criticism of war. I do think it's a history. That's how I read it. It felt like he was doing reporting, like original reporting as a war correspondent, but using fictional characters to tell the story of what he experienced there.
As you were talking about that, I was reminded of a thing that someone quoted this. I want to say it was Ezra Klein.
Yeah.
But I'm not positive. So it's by Mark Sprague, and he says, I'm of the nature to grow old. I'm of the nature to get sick. I'm of the nature to lose people I love. I'm of the nature to die. So how then shall I live? Which feels very Robert Jordan, where he's just very accepting of, he like accepts death.
Really, really comfortably.
Really comfortably.
Yeah.
I don't know, going back to the conversation of like expanding community versus restricting. Like, do you want to live your whole life restricting community? Is that what you want your life to stand for? Do you think you like this book because you're a journalist?
Probably.
And you're like,
honestly, because I was like, how would I write about that? I guess I like war books. I didn't know I did. But I like books where people are being very courageous, even if it seems stupid.
It's
no, there's something special there, even though I just argued that it's like that there's no moral high ground in.
Well, it's interesting because I also like war books from more specifically the books that came out from post World War II.
Yeah.
So like Kurt Vonnegut, Joseph Heller. Those are the only ones coming to my mind.
Yeah.
You know, but those teams definitely take the side of being really critical of war. Which makes sense coming from the people who had to fight like atrocious war. Yeah. Atrocities and be held in atrocious situations.
Because this book, I think it is critical of war. I think it's critical of fascism is what I think it is.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's critical of war, but I do think it kind of leans into the idea that all these people's deaths were unnecessary.
Yeah.
Because the way it does describe the uprising of fascism and all the disappearances of the people was horrendous. And you don't get into that till the second half of the book when you go into the backgrounds of the people. But like it really goes into detail and it is like horrifying. It gave me an education on the Spanish Civil War that I did not know at all. Why do you think it's banned?
Okay, this is what I wrote. Guesses as to why this book is banned? Boring.
It's banned because it's boring.
Yeah. I wrote fascism, and then just from the Spark Notes that I read, sexual assault, Robert Jordan and Maria have relations.
They do. Yeah, they have a lot of relations. And she feels very young.
Yeah. And then I wrote also just war. Maybe being critical of war. I don't know.
I think it's because of the sexual relations between Robert Jordan and Maria. And they swear a lot, and there's a lot of crude jokes. And there's a Russian soldier who fights alongside the Republic against fascism because we know communism and fascism are enemies. So there's like some pro-communism stuff in there. I bet that has something to do with it. That's my theory.
Okay. So in 1940, when it was published, it was declared non-mailable by the U.S. Post Office.
Turkey banned it really quickly, the country of Turkey.
Yeah.
Right?
In 1973, banned in Turkey because the book included propaganda unfavorable to the state. And so 11 Turkish publishers and 8 booksellers went on trial before an Istanbul martial law tribunal on charges of publishing, possessing, and selling books in violation of an order of the Istanbul martial law command. They face possible sentences of between 1 month and 6 months imprisonment and the confiscation of their books.
Wow.
Wait, that's all it says. Hold on.
Maybe no one's read it in America because it's so long.
Let me do a little more Googling. Okay, yeah. Pro-communist and pro-republican.
Yeah.
Reflecting its depiction of the Spanish Civil War and its character. Yeah, okay. Leftist forces.
So nothing to do with Maria.
No.
Wow, it's all political. That's fascinating.
Well, they probably didn't get to the parts with Maria. They probably read the first mention of socialism or communism and were like, ugh.
Ugh, gross. I have one more quote to share before we end, and I love this. And this is something to think about. Anselmo, he's an older man in the book who's kind of more of a moral character, more depth in his thing, and Robert Jordan enjoys talking to him. But this is something that he's thinking. He says, I hope I am not for the killing. I think that after the war, there will have to be some great penance done for the killing. If we no longer have religion after the war, then I think there must be some form of civic penance organized that all may be cleansed from the killing, or else we will never have a true and human basis for living. The killing is necessary, I know, but still the doing of it is very bad for a man. And I think that after all this is over and we have won the war, there must be a penance of some kind for the cleansing of us all. So that also gives you kind of a taste of like how it's written. Pretty repetitive, very boring for Eden. But
yeah.
But it is that kind of idea. And I think as we look at our own country and what's happening here, we have to figure out a way to heal and a way to look at each other with humanity and dignity, even if we don't agree with one another. We don't have to look at the ideologies with grace and all those things. We don't have to do that at all, but we have to look at the people with humanity. Otherwise, we will all be tarnished from the political division that we're going through. Yeah, I think this book is chock full of great things, but it is a little dry. I will give you that.
Yeah. Well, I learned a lot from the Spark Notes. So if you're not going to read the actual book, the Spark Notes is just as good, I imagine. But actually, better.
Oh my gosh. I don't have anything else other than thank you so much for listening.
Yeah, nothing else for me either. Awesome. Well, thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Burn This Book was produced by us, Nicole and Eden.
Music written by myself, Nicole, and recorded by my dad, Frank. Thank you. If you like what you hear,